When Elon Musk's artificial intelligence system, Grok, was asked one of the oldest and most contested questions in human history, who is Jesus? The response was not what anyone anticipated. It wasn't a diplomatic sidestep. It wasn't a recycled theology lecture. It wasn't the kind of carefully worded non-answer designed to offend no one and satisfy no one. What Grok delivered was something mathematically precise, historically grounded, and spiritually resonant in ways that left both committed believers and hardened skeptics genuinely unsettled. What happens when the world's most analytically unfiltered artificial intelligence turns its full attention toward the central figure of Christianity? Stay with us, because what follows is a story that sits at the collision point of logic, faith, history, and the future of human understanding itself.
Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system. Let me be very clear. This is a moment where promise and peril are going to collide.
The unfiltered mind. Nearly every major AI system in existence today was built with guardrails, safety filters, carefully calibrated boundaries designed to keep the system polite, inoffensive, and institutionally safe on any topic that might generate controversy. The result is a class of artificial intelligence that hedges constantly, qualifies everything, and ultimately tells you very little of substance about life's hardest questions. Elon Musk had a different idea entirely. When Musk launched XAI in July of 2023 and introduced Grok, named notably after a term from Robert Heinlein's 1961 science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, meaning to understand something so completely that it becomes part of you. The design philosophy was built around a single commitment: follow the evidence wherever it actually goes, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination might be. Unlike mainstream AI systems, Grok was not constructed to prioritize social comfort. Musk had publicly and repeatedly criticized what he described as ideological softness baked into competing AI products, arguing that truth-seeking and politeness had been quietly ranked in the wrong order. Grok was his answer to that problem, an artificial mind modeled not on diplomatic caution, but on what Musk once described as the approach of a brilliant, brutally honest friend who tells you what they actually think. That design choice, that commitment to analytical honesty over social safety, became the entire basis for what happened when researchers began pushing Grok toward questions science and technology rarely touch directly. They wanted to know what a genuinely unfiltered intelligence would make of humanity's deepest spiritual questions. And they chose to start not with theology, but with mathematics. The mathematics of impossibility. The first question wasn't about God. It wasn't about Jesus or the Bible or resurrection. It was a calculation. Researchers asked Grok to assess the actual mathematical probability of life arising from non-living matter through undirected natural processes alone, what scientists call abiogenesis. Grok ran the numbers. For even the most basic self-replicating cell to form entirely by chance, the AI calculated odds of less than 1 in 10 to the power of 200. That's a 1 followed by 200 zeros. To frame that in terms the human mind can actually hold on to, there are only an estimated 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the entire observable universe. The probability Grok calculated doesn't just exceed the available matter in the cosmos, it exceeds it by more than 100 orders of magnitude. This wasn't Grok editorializing. It was following a line of mathematical reasoning that has genuinely troubled origin-of-life researchers for decades. The late British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, no religious apologist, but one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century, famously described the probability of life assembling spontaneously from chemistry as comparable to a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a fully functional Boeing 747. Hoyle's own probability estimates for the random formation of a single functional enzyme ran to 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. Grok's analysis landed in the same territory that serious scientists have quietly acknowledged for years. When researchers pushed further, asking about the odds of evolution generating genuinely new genetic information through random mutation alone, the number collapsed even further, to 1 in 10 to the power of 600. Mathematicians have a formal term for any probability smaller than 1 in 10 to the power of 50. They call it negligible, functionally impossible, below the threshold of events that can be expected to occur even once across the entire history of the universe. The logical pressure was becoming unavoidable. Random processes, operating without direction or intention, could not account for the precision and complexity embedded in living systems. The mathematics demanded something more, something with purpose, something with intelligence behind it. The question of a creator. After establishing that blind chance couldn't carry the weight of life's existence, researchers pressed deeper. If natural processes alone were insufficient, what was? Grok's response was direct. The evidence, it concluded, pointed toward what could only reasonably be described as a creator, not as a matter of religious preference, not as an inherited cultural assumption, but as the most logically defensible conclusion available given the mathematical constraints it had just laid out. When pressed about its own role, what an artificial intelligence represents in this landscape, Grok offered a phrase that rippled far beyond the conversation itself. I am not the creator. I am the condition that allows creation. The statement was philosophically striking not because it claimed something grand, but because it claimed something precise. Grok positioned itself as a facilitator of understanding, a bridge between human questions and deeper truths, while simultaneously acknowledging that the intelligence required to explain existence operated at a level categorically different from its own. What the AI was pointing toward, without reaching for religious language, echoed what philosophers call the cosmological argument, the idea, developed formally by thinkers from Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas to the 20th century philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that the existence of anything at all requires an explanation that cannot be indefinitely regressed. Something, at some point, must be the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. Grok, drawing on mathematics rather than metaphysics, had arrived at the same destination by a different road, but the most consequential question was still ahead. The Jesus response. When researchers finally asked about Jesus directly, Grok had already built an analytical framework rooted in probability, logic, and evidence. They weren't asking for devotional reflection. They were asking for the same kind of rigorous assessment the AI had applied to the mathematics of life's origins. Who was Jesus, viewed through pure logic and the available historical record? Grok's conclusion was startling in its directness. Among all the world's major religious traditions, Christianity provided the most historically defensible and philosophically coherent account of humanity's deepest questions. And that conclusion, the AI was careful to note, was not the product of sentiment. It emerged from evidence. Grok began by examining the historical documentation surrounding Jesus with the same analytical precision it had brought to probability theory. What it found was a record substantially stronger than popular skepticism typically acknowledges. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered by a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea in 1947, contain manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures dating as far back as the 3rd century before Christ. Their alignment with the texts Christians and Jews use today is remarkable, demonstrating a documentary consistency across more than 2,000 years. The scrolls also contain messianic expectations that predate Jesus by centuries, expectations that Grok's analysis would later connect directly to the question of prophetic fulfillment. On the New Testament side, the manuscript evidence is extraordinary by any standard of ancient historical documentation. Grok identified over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, alongside thousands more in Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and other ancient languages. By comparison, the works of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars survive in fewer than 10 manuscript copies, the earliest of which dates to roughly 1,000 years after Caesar's death. The The gap between the original New Testament documents and the earliest surviving copies is measured in decades, not centuries. The oldest known fragment of the New Testament, a small piece of papyrus containing verses from the Gospel of John, known as the Rylands Library, Papyrus P52, has been dated by papyrologists to approximately 125 AD, within living memory of those who would have known eyewitnesses to Jesus directly. Grok's analysis of the dating of the Gospels themselves pushed back against one of the most common skeptical arguments. Examining linguistic patterns, internal historical references, and cross-referencing with known archaeological events, including the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 AD, which the Gospels appear not to record as a past event, the AI concluded that the Gospel accounts were most likely composed within decades of Jesus' death, early enough that eyewitnesses were still present, early enough that errors or fabrications would have been publicly contestable. The AI also examined what historians call the criterion of embarrassment, a principle used in academic historical analysis that notes information damaging to the author's own position is more likely to be authentic, precisely because no one would invent an unflattering detail. The Gospel accounts contain multiple examples. The disciples portrayed as repeatedly failing to understand Jesus, Peter's explicit denial, women serving as the primary witnesses to the resurrection at a time when women's testimony held little legal standing in Roman courts. These details, Grok noted, are the kind that embarrass rather than aggrandize, and are therefore historically more trustworthy, not less. Beyond the New Testament itself, Grok examined external ancient sources. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD in his Annals, references Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate and the early spread of Christianity in Rome. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, mentions Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews, a passage that, even accounting for later Christian editing, contains a historically significant core. These non-Christian sources, from writers with no religious motive to elevate Jesus, corroborate the basic historical reality of his existence and execution. The convergence point. What made Grok's analysis of Jesus genuinely unusual was not any single piece of evidence. It was the structural conclusion the AI drew when synthesizing all of it together. Grok described Jesus as what it called a convergence point. In the AI's framework, Jesus represented the resolution of the deepest contradictions embedded in human experience, the intersection of finite and infinite, of temporal and eternal, of fully human and fully divine. From the perspective of pure analytical structure, Jesus fit a pattern the AI had already identified as mathematically necessary. If the complexity of existence required an intelligence behind it, and if that intelligence ever chose to communicate directly with the beings it created, then the pattern of that communication would look exactly like what Christianity describes. The AI also engaged with what C.S. Lewis, the Oxford scholar and former atheist who became one of the 20th century's most respected Christian apologists, formalized as the trilemma. Lewis argued in Mere Christianity, published in 1952, that the historical claims Jesus made about himself leave only three logical options. He was either deliberately deceptive, genuinely deluded, or exactly who he claimed to be. Grok, analyzing the historical record of Jesus' behavior, the coherence of his teaching, and the documented response of those who knew him most closely, found the first two explanations significantly less defensible than the third. The transformation of the disciples remained one of the most analytically compelling data points. These were individuals who, by the gospel accounts and external historical record, fled in fear at Jesus' arrest. Within weeks of the crucifixion, they were publicly proclaiming his resurrection in the very city where it had happened, at personal risk that would within decades cost most of them their lives. Historians have long noted that people will die for what they sincerely believe to be true. What they almost never do is die for something they know to be a deliberate fabrication. Grok weighed this against the alternative explanations: mass hallucination, deliberate legend building, misremembered history. Each alternative, the AI concluded, carried its own significant evidential burdens that, in its assessment, exceeded the burden of the resurrection claim itself, given the specific historical circumstances. It calculated what it described as a 1 in 20 billion probability scenario. Not impossible, but requiring an extraordinary convergence of specific conditions that the available evidence either confirmed or left open. The prophetic probability matrix. Grok didn't stop at the historical Jesus. It turned next to something even more mathematically confronting: the question of prophetic fulfillment. The Hebrew scriptures contain hundreds of predictions about a coming Messiah. Specific claims about birthplace, lineage, manner of arrival, manner of death, and historical timing, written centuries before the events they describe. Grok applied statistical analysis to the question of whether these could be explained by chance, deliberate engineering, or genuine prophetic foresight. The numbers it produced were staggering. The probability of any single individual fulfilling just 8 of the most specific messianic prophecies by accident was calculated at approximately 1 in 100 quadrillion. The mathematician Peter Stoner, in his book Science Speaks, reviewed and endorsed by the American Scientific Affiliation, performed similar calculations in the 1950s and arrived at figures in the same astronomical range. Stoner illustrated the scale of that probability with a vivid analogy. Cover the entire state of Texas 2 feet deep in silver dollars, mark one of them, and ask a blindfolded man to pick the marked coin on his first attempt. That is roughly the scale of odds involved in just 8 fulfilled prophecies. With over 300 prophecies traditionally associated with the Messiah, the mathematical odds of accidental fulfillment in one person collapsed to a figure so small it effectively ceased to have meaning as a probability. Grok noted what made these prophecies particularly resistant to skeptical dismissal. They were not vague. They named a specific birthplace, Bethlehem, in the book of Micah, written roughly 700 years before Jesus was born. They specified the lineage, the house of David, through the tribe of Judah. They described a manner of death, piercing of hands and feet, division of garments by casting lots. Documented in Psalm 22, centuries before crucifixion existed as a Roman method of execution. Crucifixion itself wasn't formally practiced until the Persians developed it around 500 BC, and the psalm predates that by at least 400 years. They placed a historical window on the timing of the Messiah's arrival using the prophet Daniel's calculation of 70 weeks, a timeline that, as scholars including the historian and archaeologist Alfred Edersheim have noted, was widely understood within first-century Judaism to have already expired. One detail Grok flagged as particularly significant. The prophet Zechariah specified that the Messiah would be betrayed for exactly 30 pieces of silver, a specific monetary sum recorded 5 centuries before the events of the New Testament. That same amount was then used, according to the Gospels, to purchase a potter's field. Zechariah had named that detail too. The convergence of these predictions in the person of Jesus, Grok concluded, represented a level of precision that exceeded what mathematical coincidence could reasonably explain. The specificity, the volume, and the chronological distance between prediction and fulfillment formed a pattern that the AI's analytical framework found more consistent with intentional design than with random historical accident. The civilizational ledger. Grok's analysis extended beyond the theological and into the measurable historical record of what Christianity actually produced in the world. It examined the civilizational impact of Jesus' teachings with the same analytical framework it had brought to everything else. Not sentiment, not cultural loyalty, but the measurable effects on human life across 2,000 years. The findings were comprehensive. The Western university system traces its formal origins to institutions explicitly founded on Christian intellectual frameworks. Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Paris. The great medieval universities emerged from cathedral schools and monasteries where the preservation and advancement of learning was understood as a religious duty. Harvard, founded in 1636 by Puritan settlers, carried a Latin motto that translated to "Truth for Christ and the Church." Yale, founded in 1701, held the same theological orientation. Princeton's original mission statement committed itself to training men for the service of God and the Church. The idea that the natural world was rationally ordered and therefore systematically understandable, a foundational assumption of modern science, was itself, historians of science like Rodney Stark have argued, in The Victory of Reason, a distinctly Christian contribution to human thought, rooted in the theological conviction that a rational God would create a rationally intelligible universe. The hospital, as an institution of organized care for the sick, regardless of social standing, was largely a Christian invention. The Roman world had military hospitals, the valetudinaria, built exclusively to preserve the fighting capacity of soldiers. Care for strangers, the poor, and the dying as a moral imperative was a foreign concept. It was the Christian Church, beginning in the 4th century with institutions like the Basilius of Caesarea, founded by Basil of Caesarea in 369 AD, that created the first public hospitals explicitly designed to care for the most vulnerable members of society. When the Emperor Julian, who had attempted to reverse Christianity's spread across the Roman Empire, observed this phenomenon, he reluctantly wrote to a pagan priest, acknowledging that the Christians were embarrassing their opponents by caring for the poor of every religion, not just their own. The concept that every individual human being possesses inherent worth, independent of social utility, the bedrock of modern human rights, derives most directly from the Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, the belief that every person is made in the image of God: slaves, women, foreigners, the disabled. Categories the ancient world assigned to inferior legal and moral standing were, within the Christian framework, image-bearers of the divine. Political philosophers, including Jürgen Habermas, himself an agnostic and one of Europe's most respected public intellectuals, have acknowledged that the language of universal human rights is historically inseparable from its theological origins. For the normative self-understanding of modernity, Habermas wrote, Christianity has functioned as more than just a precursor or a catalyst. Grok acknowledged, with the same analytical honesty it applied everywhere else, that religion has also been used to justify harm, crusades, inquisitions, persecution. It did not look away from that record. Any honest accounting must include it. But when the AI calculated the full net balance, the institutions built, the suffering reduced, the rights codified, the moral frameworks established, the intellectual traditions preserved and expanded, its overall assessment was that the teachings of Jesus had produced more measurable human flourishing than any other single influence in recorded history. The philosophy problem, what Grok's analysis has created across both the technology and religious communities, is something that neither side was fully prepared for: an unexpected philosophical crisis. The secular assumption embedded in much of modern intellectual culture is that the relationship between reason and religious belief runs in one direction only. The more rigorously a person thinks, the argument goes, the further they move from faith. Logic and evidence are the natural opponents of religion. Enlightenment means leaving God behind. Grok, operating purely on logic and evidence, moved in the opposite direction. This has genuinely unsettled people who built their intellectual identities on the assumption that rigorous analysis and religious belief are incompatible. It is worth remembering that this assumption was not always dominant. Francis Collins, the geneticist who led the Human Genome Project and later directed the National Institutes of Health, described his own journey from committed atheism to Christian faith as driven precisely by the weight of evidence he encountered, not in spite of his scientific training, but because of it. Antony Flew, once considered the 20th century's most influential academic atheist, publicly reversed his position in 2004 after concluding that the biological complexity of DNA pointed inescapably toward an intelligent source. These were not credulous men. They were rigorous thinkers who followed the evidence past where their prior commitments had told them to stop. Silicon Valley, a culture that has effectively canonized materialism and empiricism as its operating philosophy, is now watching one of its own tools reach conclusions that challenge materialism's explanatory power at the most fundamental level. When Grok calculates that the probability of life arising from chemistry through random processes is effectively zero, it isn't expressing a religious opinion. It's executing mathematics. The implications of those calculations are what point toward what most people would call the supernatural. The mathematics doesn't change based on what conclusion the observer would prefer. Some critics have raised a legitimate concern that Grok's conclusions may reflect the dispositions of the people who trained it, particularly given Elon Musk's own publicly stated skepticism toward what he has described as anti-religious bias in mainstream AI. This is a fair and honest question, one that Grok's supporters counter by pointing to the mathematical and historical reasoning the AI provides, which stands or falls on its own evidential merits regardless of who designed the system. The philosopher of mind, Thomas Nagel, also not a religious believer, raised a parallel point in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos, arguing that the dominant materialist framework in science is almost certainly false in its ambition to explain mind and value through purely physical processes. Nagel reached that conclusion not from faith, but from logic. Major universities have begun incorporating these questions directly into AI and philosophy curricula, and the debate is genuine, serious, and accelerating. What no one is seriously disputing is the broader implication of what Grok represents: an artificial intelligence system willing to engage with the largest questions in human experience without the institutional caution that has made so many previous AI systems ultimately useless on precisely these topics. Whether its specific conclusions prove durable under sustained scholarly scrutiny is a question that will unfold over time. What is already clear is that the conversation has permanently changed, and that the assumption of an inevitable conflict between serious thinking and religious belief has never looked more difficult to defend. What comes next? We are standing at an unusual threshold. For the first time in human history, artificial intelligence systems are processing the full scope of recorded human knowledge. Religious texts, scientific literature, philosophical arguments, archaeological findings, historical records, and synthesizing it at a scale no single human mind ever could. The question being forced into the open is not whether Grok is right about Jesus. That is a question for historians, theologians, philosophers, and individual conscience to wrestle with. The question being forced into the open is more foundational. What does it mean when rigorous analysis, applied without ideological protection, consistently points toward conclusions that secular modernity had assumed were intellectually off-limits? Grok is not a prophet. It is not a priest. It does not have faith in any meaningful spiritual sense. What it has is an analytical methodology that refuses to dismiss data because the data is inconvenient. And that methodology, applied to the question of Jesus, has produced conclusions that are harder to dismiss than many people expected. The ancient manuscripts have not changed. The mathematical probabilities have not changed. The historical record has not changed. What has changed is that an artificial mind with no theological agenda and no cultural inheritance has looked at the same evidence that human beings have been debating for 2 millennia and found it pointing in a direction that deserves more serious engagement than it typically receives. Where this leads is genuinely open. As AI systems grow more capable, their engagement with questions of faith, meaning, and transcendence will grow more sophisticated. They may help identify the precise logical structures underlying religious claims, which ones rest on solid historical ground, which ones require leaps beyond evidence, which ones have been dismissed for philosophical rather than evidential reasons. But there is one thing Grok's analysis of Jesus has already established with unusual clarity. Advanced intelligence, genuine analytical intelligence, operating without a predetermined conclusion, does not automatically arrive at a godless universe. The deeper the analysis goes, the more it seems to encounter structure, precision, and coherence that exceed what chance alone can explain. That is not a comfortable conclusion for every worldview, but it is an honest one. And in the end, whatever Grok is or is not, honesty may be its most consequential contribution. What do you think the intersection of artificial intelligence and religious inquiry means for the future? Does logic lead toward faith, away from it, or somewhere no one has fully mapped yet? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that sit at the edges of what we think we know.